Hi, my name's Alister Chapman, and in this video we're going to take a look at some of the advanced features of this camera, the Sony PXW-FS5. This camera has some really neat and very useful advanced features, and those features include slow and quick motion with the ability to shoot at up to 60 frames per second, super slow motion with the ability to shoot at up to 960 frames per second. You have center scan that allows you to use, instead of the full super 35mm sensor, a smaller super 16mm sized area. You have clear image zoom that allows you to increase the zoom range by up to 2 times with virtually no loss of image quality. You have the wonderful variable ND filter on this camera that allows you to control your exposure using the ND filter very precisely. With the addition of an optional firmware key, it's also possible to output 12-bit RAW to an external recorder. When enabled, the RAW output option makes it possible to output 4K at up to 60 frames per second, to output 120 frame per second 4K slow motion in 4-second bursts, and to output continuous 2K slow motion at 120 or 240 frames per second. To record the RAW output, you will need a compatible RAW recorder. The first feature to look at is the variable ND filter. The variable ND filter allows you to control your exposure very precisely. It acts as a kind of pair of sunglasses for the camera and controls the amount of light falling on the sensor. To engage the ND filter, you have to turn the filter wheel from its clear position to any one of the 1, 2 or 3 ND positions. When the filter wheel is in the clear position, the ND filter is actually moved entirely out of the optical path, so has no effect whatsoever. So to be able to use the variable ND filter, first of all we have to choose either the 1, 2 or 3 ND position on the filter wheel. When the ND filter switch here is set to preset, the ND filter acts much like any other traditional video camera, in so much as you have 3 positions of ND, each with a varying darkness and a clear position. But the really clever thing that you can do with this camera is when we have the ND filter engaged, we can switch this switch from preset to variable, and then using this adjustment here we can vary the ND filter in its intensity or its strength. This is particularly useful if you're using the FS5 with lenses where the aperture operates in steps, because the ND filter is visually stepless. You can't see the steps of the ND as you make that adjustment. It's also particularly useful for controlling your depth of field, because with the variable ND filter you can use the lens's aperture to set your depth of field. A large aperture like f2.8, f1.4 giving a very film-like shallow depth of field, and then we can fine-tune the exposure using the variable ND filter. The ND filter adjustment can be assigned to the scroll wheel on the hand grip if you choose. The variable ND filter can also be made to operate automatically. To do this, first you must assign the Auto ND function to one of the camera's assignable buttons. I recommend that you use either the status button or the picture profile button. Once you've assigned the Auto ND function to the assignable button, just pressing the button will enable the Auto ND filter function when the ND filter is engaged. In this example here, you can see how the Auto ND filter is compensating for a change in aperture and keeping the exposure constant. The next feature to look at is center scan. Center scan mode allows you to just use the center part of the sensor. So instead of using the full super 35mm size sensor, you're now only using the middle part. Because the sensor is a 4K sensor, this will only work in HD. So to be able to use the function, the camera must be in HD. Center scan allows you to now use a wide range of lenses on this camera, from super 16mm film lenses up to standard DSLR lenses. Compared to the full frame mode, the effective focal length of your lenses is doubled. So if I put a 16mm lens on here and I'm using center scan, it becomes the equivalent of 32mm. It's worth noting that center scan can't be combined with super slow motion. The next feature to look at is clear image zoom. Clear image zoom is a new type of digital zoom. It allows you to zoom in by up to 2 times electronically. So if you put a prime lens on this camera, that's a lens with a fixed focal length, and engage clear image zoom, in HD you can use the zoom rocker on the camera to zoom in and out by up to 2 times. In UHD, this is limited to 1.5 times. If you're using a Sony zoom lens, perhaps you have the 18 to 105mm kit lens on the camera. When clear image zoom is engaged, when you zoom in with the zoom rocker, the optical zoom will function first, and when you reach the end of the lens's optical zoom range, the clear image zoom function takes over, extending the zoom range of the lens. Clear image zoom is very clever. It has a database of textures within the camera, and then the camera detects the type of thing that you're shooting and applies the appropriate image processing to the picture depending on the texture of what you are filming. One of the most useful features on the camera is its S&Q motion and super slow motion. S&Q motion allows you to shoot from 1 to 60 frames per second. If you shoot at a very low frame rate, for example 1 frame per second, that will speed up time. As an example, if I set the camera to 24 frames per second for its base recording settings, and then I engage S&Q motion by pressing the S&Q motion button here, and then press and hold the S&Q motion button again to enable you to choose the frame rate that you want to shoot at, if I go down to 1 frame per second, when I play the clip back, it'll be sped up by 24 times. That's really useful for time-lapse. If you're shooting at very low frame rates, such as 1 frame per second, another thing that you might want to consider is changing the shutter speed to a much longer shutter speed. And this will give you that nice blurred headlight effect when shooting traffic, cars, or objects moving around in low light. With S&Q motion in HD, it's possible to shoot at up to 60 frames per second. Again, if my camera's base setting is set to 24 frames per second, and I engage S&Q motion, and now set the frame rate to 60 frames per second, when the clip is played back, it'll be slowed down by 2.4 times, giving me some nice slow motion. In UHD, S&Q motion is limited to the range of 1 to 30 frames per second. If you really want to slow down the action with this camera, then you have the super slow motion mode. To engage super slow motion, press the S&Q button twice, and that will put it into the super slow motion mode. To change the frame rate that you're shooting at in super slow motion, press and hold the S&Q button, and then use the scroll wheel here or the joystick on the hand grip to select the frame rate that you want. Now, it's important to note with super slow motion that the footage is actually stored in a memory in the camera before being written to the SD cards. You simply can't write HD at 240 frames per second or faster to SD cards directly, so you have to have this memory buffer system. That does introduce a limit as to how long you can shoot for when you're shooting in S&Q motion at any one time. This table here gives you an idea of the different durations that you can shoot for when using super slow motion, depending on the frame size. Now up to 240 frames per second, the frame is full HD. Above 240 frames per second, it's an HD sized frame, but the vertical resolution is a little reduced. Now whether you notice that or not will depend on what you're shooting, so the best thing to do is to test it, play it back and have a look and judge for yourself. Above 480 frames per second, the resolution is quite reduced, and again I recommend you test and evaluate to see whether it's suitable for your application. When shooting in super slow motion, because you're using the internal memory in the camera, you're given the option of 3 different record triggers. The first is a start trigger, and that's very simple. You press record, and then the camera's internal memory will start filling up with your slow motion footage. Once it's full, that footage is then written to the SD card. Now, while the footage is being written to the SD card, you can't then shoot any further super slow motion footage. You have to wait for that process to finish. The trigger that I find very useful for super slow motion is the end trigger. Once you've selected end trigger, the camera's memory starts to fill with slow motion footage, and that is constantly being filled and cycled. With end trigger, when you press the record button, the time period prior to pressing record is transferred from the internal memory to the SD card. This is particularly useful for unexpected events, and I used it to film the geysers in Iceland because you never know when they're going to erupt. But using end trigger, I was able to simply point the camera at the geyser, wait for the geyser to erupt, and then press the record button, and the time interval prior to pressing record is then copied to the SD card, capturing that erupting geyser. Something else you should know about shooting at high speed with super slow motion is that very often your shutter speed will be faster than the lights that you might be shooting under are operating at, and this can result in flicker or dark bands scrolling down through your footage. One of the problems here is that when the footage is transferred from the camera's internal memory to the SD card, that transfer takes place at 2 times the playback speed, and you don't actually see every single frame that's being recorded. As a result, during that transfer process, you may not see flicker in the footage. So I strongly recommend that if you are shooting super slow motion, especially under artificial lighting, that after you've done your first shot, you play it back to check for flicker and problems with dark bands and things like that. If you are experiencing dark bands and flicker, try shooting at a lower speed. The faster you go, the worse the problem will get. So if you have a problem, for example, at 240 frames per second, try 120 frames per second.